Hello everyone. If not, it's not me. Well, good evening. Many thanks to the Fundación Libertad for allowing me to be part of this meeting, which was also honored by so many personalities such as President Macri, President Lacal Pu, President Aznar, Dr. Bullrich, Genius Patricia. So, obviously, when one has to choose a presentation, I say that one has to get used to and adapt to what the needs of the moment are and to the place where one is and given the discussion. Let's say that today it is so present in Argentina on the subject of inflation, on the discussion of the exchange rate and that type of issues, and given that I am in front of a qualified audience, an audience that is accustomed to receiving economic analysis. The intention of this talk is basically to tell you what our vision is of how to confront and attack and exterminate once and for all the problem of inflation in Argentina, which has a clear start date, which is when that nefarious institution that is on Reconquista 266 called the Central Bank of the Argentine Republic was created. That is why the presentation is called Money, Prices, Monetary Policy and Inflation. Another thing that I discovered in my interaction with various local economists is that the vast majority of local economists, professionals and renowned, have no idea about something so important in this, which is the problem of the nominal anchor, and because they basically do not understand what money is. That is to say, Keynes in that disastrous treatise called General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, caused such great damage that we still, let's say, continue to inherit some problems of defining the conceptual framework, which makes us economists make so many mistakes so often. In fact, just in the car we were reviewing a joke that said, of the last 5 recessions, how many did economists predict? 9. I say, beyond the jokes of this, then I say, it is fundamental and key to understand what money is. In other words, what one realizes is that they discuss the problem of inflation and do not understand what money is. There is the Colossus of Federico Sturzenegger. What a pleasure, I just saw him. Thank you, Federico. So, basically what I am going to do is an introduction about what money is, and from there, let's say, I am going to derive the monetary nature of inflation. I am going to demystify some kind of questions that are floating around, and then I am going to discuss the current situation, about the enormous work that Luis Caputo, Santiago Basili and their entire team are doing, of whom I am truly, deeply proud. So, the first thing is, if there were no money, what would the economy be like? Well, the economy would be a barter economy where goods are exchanged for goods. Now, in a small society that is not a problem in principle, but in a larger society it is a problem, because you have a problem called double coincidence. That is, you have to find someone who wants to buy what you have and at the same time, let's say, match. That is, who also wants what you have. Therefore, this process becomes very, very difficult. But apart from the fact that this process is extremely difficult, a second problem appears, which is the problem of indivisibility. Because yes, I may want to buy bread, the baker wants to buy the economic analysis service, but let's say, that is, the number of kilos of bread that he has to give me so that I can talk to him for an hour about economics, does not map out, at least today and after my time as president, much more so. Because I have to continue working afterwards. So, now, faced with this situation, the man did not stay crying. I mean, it is not that he started crying in a corner, I say. And he cried because of the problem of double coincidence and indivisibility. He looked for a way around it. And he looked for a way around it and discovered that there were goods that were exchanged much more than others. That is to say, then, it is not that he bought those goods that were exchanged a lot because in principle he wanted to have them, but rather that he acquired them in order to use them as an indirect means to buy other goods. That is to say, the idea of the indirect exchange good. That is, and when the indirect exchange good appears, what is appearing there is, precisely, money. That is, that good that acts as an indirect exchange good, precisely there we find the appearance of money. So, for example, when man was nomadic, the first money that appeared, what was it? Cattle. Why? Because cattle was what they ate, and since they were nomads, it allowed them to move with the cattle. Consequently, they used cattle as currency. Later, man became sedentary, so they discovered that there were other more efficient ways of using money. One of the things that people consumed a lot of was bread. So what did they start using as an indirect exchange good? Wheat. So it's not that they bought or sold wheat because they were interested in wheat per se, but, in fact, they used it a lot because it was an indirect exchange good. Now, not only that. Then, for example, I say when someone says the term salary. And why was it salary? Because basically it was paid in salt. Why was salt so important? Look, if there were people who were doing very well in ancient times, it was the people who carried spices everywhere, because it allowed them to give food a taste. Have you ever noticed what it's like to eat food without any seasoning? It's filthy. I don't know what's funny about it, but try to do it. It's a horrible thing. Especially notice what happens to you when you go on a diet. There are some diets that are a little more complicated, especially the one with public spending. More than applause, I say. We should be rejoicing that for the first time we are hitting public spending hard and evenly. We are fulfilling Rothbard's dream. It's incredible, isn't it? Let's say, a real 35% drop in public spending. Come on guys, that's getting the state out of the way. In other words, the real fiscal pressure is the size of the state. If we hit it with such a cut, I'm giving you freedom back like crazy. Furthermore, going back to the issue of salt, why the tradition of giving the room to the other person, of putting it and not giving it directly in their hand? Because they say that if not it would be bad luck. And how was the issue of payment? I say you would come to the guy with a sack, imagine, then you would pay him with a sack of salt. Imagine if when you were handling the salt, it fell and it was bad luck. It was an instant loss for sure. In that context, That's why let's say that the salt was placed on top of each other and weighed, and there the exchange was made. There have been other currencies, such as tobacco. In fact, there is one. Milton Friedman tells a story, in one of his lectures, in which he says that in Germany, let's say, after the Second World War, when hyperinflation came, they used nails. They used cognac, and he says that it is the most liquid definition of liquid money that he had ever known. In other words, he had found the true M1. I'm talking about economist jokes, don't worry. I'll come with the subtitles for the next lecture. Now, what was the problem with all those types of money that had appeared? They were commodities, that is, they had a use value as a commodity. But they were also used to make transactions then, and that served as money. Or let's say, when we work in microeconomics and we start in general equilibrium, we talk about currency. Now, what is the problem with that type of currency? Well, one does not live in a single period. In other words, they could serve as a unit of account. They could serve as a generalized means of payment, but what happens? They did not preserve value. And since the economy, let's say, fortunately is not a single period economy, but rather an intertemporal economy, which includes several periods, it degraded over time. That is, as if it had a negative interest rate. So what man discovered? Man looked for metals. And that is how two currencies appeared, which is gold for large transactions and silver for smaller transactions. So, see what is most important in all this, that is, why I am going through this whole story of why money appears, how money appears, to understand that money is an indirect exchange good. And being an indirect exchange good, what does that mean? That its demand is a derived demand. That is, I do not demand money to take it to the wooden suit, I demand money to make transactions. And basically I want to use that money to finance a consumption path throughout my life. That is why I use money. Now, if I then money has that connotation, that characteristic, what does the demand for money depend on then? And that is where we start to encounter these problems. Because if I am defining it this way, the demand for money has as its counterpart the intertemporal path of consumption. That is, my consumption program throughout my life. Now, if I start to derive the demand for consumption of each of these goods, which is what is going to determine how the demand for money is the counterpart, what does that demand for consumer goods depend on? And in the end, that demand for consumer goods is going to depend on what, may he rest in peace, Robert Lucas Jr. said. That it depends on the deep parameters. That is, it depends on preferences, it depends on technology, and it depends on endowments. I say, therefore, if the endowments are given, the preferences are given in the technology, let's say, it is a case, let's say, without making any assumption about technological progress, which is also given, and if they want to assume it, let's say, they will put it inside the model. Basically, as a physicist would say, under normal conditions of pressure and temperature, the demand for money should be an absolutely granitic thing, which has as its counterpart my intertemporal consumption path that depends on the deep parameters that are given data. That is, this is a very interesting subject because, I say, what happens? Because, if then the real demand for money, which is what I just said, and without the presence of that nefarious entity that issues little pieces of paper, I say, should be a rather hard, granitic thing. And that should equal the real balances. That is, the amount of money divided by the price level. So, notice that there you find the monetary theory of inflation. Because you are going to determine that the price level is going to be given by the quotient between the supply of money and the demand for money. And there, when you increase the amount of money, what you are going to do is determine the price level. It is what is called the nominal anchor problem. Moreover, when you derive the demand functions of each of these goods, as they are homogeneous of degree 0, you determine the relative prices, and by determining that money is the currency, what the central bank does is that all the prices remain determined in money. That is, it determines the nominal scale of the economy. That is, the famous nominal anchor. That is, the way in which I am anchoring the price level is by fixing the amount of money. So, since we took office in December, the monetary base has been constant, even though we bought $15 billion, even though our puts went up, even though we had to pay the remunerated liabilities. The contraction due to BOPREAL and the contraction due to the fiscal surplus has been such that it compensated for all that and left the monetary base constant, which is why inflation is falling. Later I will continue with the issues that have to do with the present, but, I mean, when some professional economists say, I assume that some, let's say, out of ignorance, others out of resentment, others because, let's say, if they wanted to commit suicide, the best thing they could do is jump off the top of their ego. I mean, they would be fried down. There is no stabilization plan. And how does the inflation rate go down? What is it? Magic? No. We leave the amount of money constant. What's more, I say, when you make the configuration of a stabilization program, it basically has three central elements. You have a fiscal policy, you have a monetary policy, and you have an exchange policy. In the exchange rate area, we find a gap of 200%. It's incredible, because some economists appear saying the exchange rate lag. Those same ones who say that there is an exchange rate lag problem are the same ones who said that the dollar should be set at 600 and they had a hypothesis of higher inflation. We set it at the equivalent of 1,000 and we have less inflation. I mean, they could be at least, I don't know, coherent to be intellectually not so dishonest. That's the first, one of the things. The other part is the fiscal policy, zero deficit. What did they say? No. It's impossible to achieve zero deficit in 2024. And we started to look at the numbers and I said, and we spoke with Toto and he told me, it seems to me that we reached zero deficit in March. Why? I got mad. Poor Guillermo Francos is suffering. How is Guillermo? Throw away the lay bases, do whatever you want with this, let's say with the program. We are going to achieve all this despite the politics, and boy are we doing it. And what did we find? That what was impossible we achieved in the first month. In January we reached financial equilibrium, that is to say we had a primary surplus and we also paid the interests, that is to say we reached financial equilibrium. So, what did the bunch of blunderers say? Instead of recognizing that they blundered, nah, well, it's too little chainsaw and too much blender. I say, ask what happened with public works. Ask what happened with discretionary transfers. Ask what happened with the intermediaries of the plans. Ask what happened with the number of public employees. It seems to me that the chainsaw is a little bit bigger. In fact, most of the adjustment is chainsaw, and I'll tell you something. I say, sometimes the blender becomes permanent, also in chainsaw. I say to be clear then. The final chainsaw is a matter of time until we finish stabilizing. In fact, and to those who say, no, well, but you are not liberals, you raised taxes. Oh, did we raise taxes? I usually use a very interesting example to understand the theft that is monetary policy, which is the case of an economy that makes transactions in gold. Let's suppose that we have an economy that makes transactions in gold coins, and now a couple of friends of mine appear here. A physicist appears and a chemist appears, and they bring me the formula to convert plastic into gold. So, what do we start to do? We start to buy plastic. So, what do we start to do? Let's start to counterfeit gold. The question is, if I had that gold stored in my house, or I have a self-esteem problem and then I want to brag that I have a whole house of gold and it's not gold. Let's say it's fake gold, then I take it and do all that. I mean, up to that point there is no problem because I am not committing any fraud. Up to that point there is nothing. That is, the only thing I am doing is counterfeiting. The problem appears when I put that fake gold into the economy as if it were good, and when I do that, what is the problem? I am increasing the supply of gold, and when the supply of gold increases, the purchasing power of gold falls. That is, all prices expressed in units of gold rise. What is that called? Inflation. That is, where the real fraud is not inflation, the real fraud is seigniorage. It is the monetary issue that is the real fraud, because I ask you a question. If you had a growing economy and the central bank issues according to the growth of the demand for money as a consequence of the growth of the economy, assuming that consumption was a constant fraction of income, I say that everything is perfect in terms of the structure that I used. So, what is happening? Inflation is zero. Is there no fraud there? Yes, there is fraud. Yes, there is fraud. So, I say, of course when they want to calculate the inflation tax, it doesn't add up. Because when they calculate the rate, it gives the inflation rate divided by 1, plus the inflation rate. So, since it's zero, then it doesn't add up. In reality, there is fraud. Why is there fraud? Because if they hadn't issued, there would be deflation. That is, deflation is something healthy. That is, deflation, I say, in fact, for the classics who spent all day looking at what was happening in the economy and then writing. It wasn't a problem for them. That's why I strongly recommend a wonderful book by Philip Bogus, called Defending Deflation. What happens is that when there is deflation, that is, there are some who win and there are others who lose. Well, yes, let's say, those who lose have more exposure and well, of course, I say then, deflation is bad. But it's not bad because it actually derives from economic growth itself. It implies returning resources to the people. This means that the real fraud is the issuance of money. This is very interesting, because the criminal government that preceded us, in the 4 years of government, issued 28 points of GDP, you bunch of thieves. Not only that, because of those 28 points of GDP, in the last year they issued 13 points of GDP. And if you consider, let's say, direct and indirect issuance, and if you consider that the monetary base, not the broad one, but the basic monetary base is 2.6% of GDP, they left us implicitly, in that alone, a multiplication of the price level by 5 times. Not only that, they also left us a bankrupt central bank, where there was a relationship of remunerated liabilities of 4 times to 1. Not only that, but they also left us with a monetary surplus. Of course, when you did all the basic calculations, let's say, that showed that we were going to find ourselves with inflation of around 15,000%. I mean, that guy, the Soviet guy, the one in the province. That was an exaggeration, he said, that doesn't happen. And the reality is that when we, let's say, entered December, in the first week, prices were growing at 1% per day. That annualized gave 3,700% per year. They say, no, but if I add 1 plus 365 times, it gives me 360. In other words, they don't even know how to calculate how inflation works, which is exponential. That's how we are. Then when you take the first 2 weeks, because the previous government had left a lot of price controls and released them all just before we took office, their inflation accelerated to 7,500% per year. And there are some shameless people, there are colleagues, intellectually dishonest, who deny that there was inflation, a planted hyperinflation, who deny that there was a potential for hyperinflation of around 15,000%. And when you take the wholesale inflation for the month of December was 54%. That annualized is 17,000. That is to say, we assumed that wholesale inflation was running at 17,000% and that inflation was running at 17,000%, that is to say 54% monthly. Given the enormous work that my entire team is carrying out, today that wholesale inflation is at 5%. That is to say, we lowered it by 90% at the rate at which the inflation rate grows, and there is no doubt that we are going to exterminate it. So, I had a whole part where I argued with Keynes, but I am going to omit it. Yes, because let's say I get a little dense, intense. I am going to try to maintain the forms. So, the first thing is interesting. Because, clearly, we have a stabilization program, a disinflation program. Because inflation is going down for some reason. It is not that it is going down by magic. In fact, there is another central element of why the inflation rate is going down. One of the great things that is worthy of admiration is the work that Santiago is doing at the central bank and his entire team, Santiago Bossoli. Why is this so important? Because, look, when you have a bankrupt central bank, meaning that the liabilities are worth more than its assets, the only way you correct the bankruptcy, traditionally, is through a tremendous inflationary surge, so that the monetary liabilities shrink. And the more bankrupt they are, the inflation rate that you need is much higher to leave the net worth in balance. So, to the extent that you have a price level of today, to the extent that you go to a bankruptcy of the central bank and need to liquefy that, it implies higher prices, higher inflation. So when you take the price level that leaves the balance of the central bank in balance, with respect to the price level it has today, you put that together. It gives you a line, and the slope of that line is the inflation rate. So as you begin to clean up the central bank's balance sheet, what you are lowering is the inflation rate. This is a very interesting topic. That is to say, the work that the central bank does is fundamental. The cleanup is fundamental to lower the inflation rate. But what do you want me to say if there was someone who said, you can't dollarize if there are no noodles and no sauce, and you invite me noodles with sauce? He was wrong. But it is easier to dump dumpsters of manure than to admit the error. In fact, one of the things, look, let's say if those who are murmuring have drunk the drink, I'm sorry. Life is like that. In fact, notice that we had several proposals for dollarization. As we moved forward, some fell apart, others remained standing. The only one that remained standing is the one we had proposed, which was to take over the liabilities of the central bank. Sorry, the central bank's assets should be converted into market securities, which obviously have a huge discount, yes, and with those securities, they should be put against dollars, and making all the corrections so that those securities would rise in price and that offered a huge business. Well, I'll let you know that when we took over, the bonds were at $18. Put 20 to round it off. Today the bonds are above 60. We received the country risk at 2,900. Today we are at 1150. In other words, we are also experiencing a fall in the country risk like few times seen in Argentine history. And you know what? That predicts that the economy will rebound in the future. That's why, let's say, they are so nervous. That's why they use noble causes to try to destabilize a government, because they know they are going to lose and they will never come back. So, look, when we received that monumental deficit of 15 points of GDP, 5 in the Treasury and 10 in the central bank, today, between the adjustment we made in the Treasury and the adjustment made by the central bank, we lowered it from 15 points to 13. Not only that, when the year ends, we will have returned 15 points of GDP in savings to the private sector. Do you want to know how the economy is going to grow? It will go up like a scuba diver. But there is no nominal anchor, thank goodness. Well, let's say, then there is an anchor. Let's say the case of the nominal anchor when you set the amount of money. Obviously it is not the only way to anchor. There are things that I really find funny, right? Because economists come and say, no, well, because there is no comprehensive plan. Because it should define the productive matrix of the next, let's say, I don't know, 5 years. Do you want a 5-year plan? I am not Leontief, I am not a communist. I am a libertarian liberal. I believe in freedom. I believe that this should be determined by businessmen, not by a fatally arrogant bureaucrat in an office. Or when they say, no, well, but you should set the path of prices. Wages. I say, again guys, I am a liberal, I believe in the price system. That is to say, in order to determine, to be able to know what the price vector is, you should, again, know the preferences, the technology and the endowments. But if you also want to do it intertemporally, you have to do it from today until the end of history. And also, with which you have to know how the population is going to move, how, let's say, the preferences are going to move, how, let's say, the technology is going to move. What's more, things that you previously believed were not in the endowments become endowments, or look. Let's say if we conquer Mars and bring resources from Mars, there are a lot of issues. In order to be able to get all that right, one would have to be omniscient, omnipresent and omnipotent. That is to say, you would have to be God. I mean, look, as much as it pains politicians, they are not God. I would tell them that they are worse than the average human being. Because when I entered politics, let's say, and after a while, a journalist asked me, somewhat aggressively, he said to me, well, but you entered politics and you always complain about politicians. What do you think now? So I told him I was wrong. He said, you saw that in the end they weren't so good. No, I was wrong for the worse. They are much worse than I imagined. That's why the system of freedom works much better, because let's say, saying that they are monkeys with knives is insulting monkeys. So, how am I going to be setting prices? No. You have to set the path of prices, they're crazy. I'm a liberal. I get hives doing that. So, not only that, not to mention, I imagine that they could start looking for the reports they receive from many professional economists who said that the real interest rate should be positive. Today, the ball of remunerated liabilities, we would have issued 4 monetary bases in the last 3 months. The problem is when the ball explodes, Federico will not have appeared with the LEBACS. Then with the LELIQS, and from now on they would be remunerated liabilities. Which, by the way, the previous government was so friendly that it left us all the remunerated liabilities for 1 day. As you can see, it was easy. It is so easy from the rostrum. The other day I was talking to Professor de Pablo and I recognized a mistake of mine. I mean from a long time ago, and the mistake was, I had entered my Rothbarthian path, so I was intense. And every time we talked about economic policy, I kind of got angry because I saw him as very condescending. Professor de Pablo interviewed all the ministers of economy and presidents of the central bank from the middle of the 20th century onwards. That created a very particular situation for me. In fact, from having lunch 3 or 4 times a month, we became somewhat more distant to preserve the friendship. Even though we had watched World Cups together, we had spent parties together. Professor de Pablo wisely said, go, learn and come back. And I admitted my mistake, because one of the things I always tried to do as an analyst was to try to incorporate the restrictions. Well, now I discovered that there are more. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult. So, I say, from the stands it's quite easy. Because there's something interesting, which is, you know what, look. You go see an Argentina game. The Argentina game is very nice, the flags, the chants, everything you want, it's fabulous. But Messi scores the goals. That is to say, if you want to win, let's say, You have to start scoring goals. I mean, and the truth is that with my team I feel like I have several Messis in the team. I feel that Toto is messy. I feel that Patricia is messy. I feel that Sandra is messy. I feel that Diana is messy. I feel that each one, I think Guillermo messy, that all of them are a messy in their position, so to speak. The truth is that I am very happy with the excellent team that we formed. Let's say, to do this you have to get involved. You have to get involved. Otherwise the orcs will govern us. And another thing that I recommend, let's say, to keep in mind that the orcs understand it perfectly, but it seems that we liberals are not so smart and we don't realize it. Power is a zero-sum game. If we have it, they don't have it. And yes, they understand that. Lopez's bags can have it and they will continue to deny it. In other words, you will find it stealing and you will deny it, and we started, no, because in reality, as an imbecile said, this is not a liberal government because it did not release drugs. Or we don't lower taxes, and it turns out that we are giving back to the Argentines 15 points of GDP in terms of non-seigniorage. That is to say, well, there is a substitution of taxes, but let's say in the net, let's say, public spending in real terms is falling. Let's say what Rothbard would say. The real pressure of the state is falling. That is to say, I am earning less. Fijan el tipo de cambio y emiten. ¿Y la consecuencia cuál es? Perdemos reservas. Entonces, cuando no le gusta la pérdida de reservas, let's say, basically I'm going to have less taxes because I have a smaller state. The other way to have a nominal anchor is by using what is called an inflation targeting system. But, let's say, the anchor is a more complicated thing, because strictly speaking, if you want to think of it in terms of the amount of money, you don't have it. Because what's the problem? Because if I'm setting the interest rate, then I don't set the amount of money, and if I don't set the amount of money, I can't set the price level. So I have what is called a nominal anchor problem. And that is solved. How? When I have inflation expectations by having, let's say, determined the expected prices, then if the expectations are anchored I can determine today's prices. I can determine the demand for money, and by determining the demand for money I determine the amount of money in the system is anchored. Of course, let's say, you have to have anchored expectations. Look, I believed that having a central bank that did things right, let's say, was possible. What's more, my great illusion was that when we had the best central bank in history, which was the one presided by Federico, I believed that we could have a central bank until December 28, 2017. Let's say that they took it away, and that was what caused the return of Kirchnerism. So, in that sense, for me, let's say the central bank, it's just a matter of time, I'm going to take it over. Beyond this, what I want, then, now is basically to finish with what we have done. How is it that we are managing to lower the inflation rate and basically back, as I said before, a zero-deficit program, where we attacked public spending head-on, where, obviously, in the first part we overreacted and the equivalent adjustment. Did you hear the other day about the puppet? It was incredible, saying, "Oh, what an insignificant adjustment. It left a deficit of more than 5 points of GDP. We brought it to 0.2 positive, and if you take it in annualized terms, we made an adjustment of 7 points of GDP." And the shameless one says insignificant result. I tell you that, in the last 123 years of history, Argentina had a deficit of 113. It means that what we are doing was not so easy. On the other hand, the sanitation of the central bank made that from having a quasi-sufficient deficit of 10 points of GDP, let's say, today it is already at 4 and on its way to 3. That is, when the next inflation rates come and we lower the rate again, we will add another point. So, when you calculate what we adjusted in the Treasury and what we sought in the central bank, we have already adjusted from 15 points, 13 points. There is no historical record in the history of humanity of an adjustment of such caliber in 3 months. But not only that, but if you look closely, both the analysts and the International Monetary Fund, when we arrived, were expecting inflation of 250%. I mean, for Argentina, in an optimistic case. Well, today the fund expects Argentina to close inflation this year at 150%. For it to close at 150% by the end of the year, the average inflation has to be 5.5%. That is to say that by the end of the year it is clear that the inflation rate, given where we started, will be well below 5%. That is to say, we are achieving it. We are ending inflation. What is more, not only that, but also, the fund is usually very aggressive in its projections. This time it fell short with the adjustment, and it fell short, let's say, with the issue of inflation because it is falling faster. That is to say, whenever they seem to be the boogeyman of the things they proposed, we are doing it much faster. On the other hand, there is another digression, let's say, that has to do with the real exchange rate. At the beginning of the presentation I mentioned the subject of some who are very intellectually dishonest, saying that the exchange rate should be set at 600 and the inflation rate would make it higher. And now they complain about the exchange rate of 1,000 and start saying, no, because there is an exchange rate appreciation. There is also, let's say, a response to this, let's say, also with a lot of wisdom from Professor de Pablo. One thing is to do economics, another thing is to do arithmetic. And there are many people doing arithmetic and little economics. I warn you that not everyone makes this mistake. Let's say I spoil the result, what Ariazu says is right. Now I will explain. Ariazu says that Argentina, if it stabilizes given the fiscal structure it has, will coexist with a very appreciated currency.
también, digamos, hay una respuesta a esto, digamos, también con mucha sabiduría del profe de Pablo.
In this context, this is not a minor issue, if we have to live with a highly appreciated currency because international prices are set as long as the Treasury does not want to get out of the way. The consequence is that we will pay in terms of lower real wages. Therefore, if we want to raise and improve the quality of life of Argentines, we have to attack the fiscal deficit. We have to attack public spending, and not only at the national level, we have to attack it also at the provincial and municipal level. We have to sweep away the treasury in all dimensions. That is, the source of our impoverishment, the source of people not having enough money, the source of there being so many poor people, so many destitute people, and there being a lot of Argentines starving to death is the fault of the damned politicians who do not want to reduce public spending. Coming back to the problems of the real exchange rate, which is a discussion that everyone likes to have, I say, the first problem is if, let's suppose we look at the series, I say, what you are going to see is that, let's say, the series looks like a roller coaster, but an endless roller coaster, I say, the first thing I would say is, a series that has so much volatility, goes up and down, let's say, it looks like the electrocardiogram of a guy who is doing a marathon, I say, the first problem is, hey, can someone explain to me what value there is in taking an average measurement? I say with all that standard deviation and with all that volatility. Can someone explain to me what sense there is in taking an average measurement? It is already a serious problem. The second serious problem with that is fixing it at a point in time. And who said that that was the equilibrium point? I mean, you realize that before we talked about fatal arrogance because we had to know the price vector, that is, we had to know the price vector at that moment. For that we had to know the preferences, the technology and the endowments of the entire economy from today until eternity. Well, now incorporate the world economy, that is, now it is not enough for you to know all that for Argentina. I mean, you have to know it for the whole world. In other words, you cannot be so fatally arrogant, and not only that, the nonsense, let's say, is crowned in a superlative way, when, let's say, that would also give you the power to explain the conditions of supply and demand of all goods in the whole world at a moment in time. This means that you can tell me, I don't know, what the real exchange rate was at the date. I don't know which one is the one that is most used in the reports now. For example, 2007, I say it randomly, I don't know, 1997, 1985, whenever you want. The question is, are the conditions of supply and demand of all economic goods identically equal to those of that moment to say that the real exchange rate has to be the same? I mean, do we fall into the problem of fatal arrogance, or do we fall into the problem of furious imbecility? I don't know. Do you like idiotic centrism so much? Because since you want it, let them apply it and do it that way. Or let's say what I suggest. Take all the neoclassical theory, a bunch of pieces, throw it back and embrace Austrian economics again? Which are the ones that truly embrace the ideas of freedom? So, thank you very much, and I'm going to tell you something. Do you know what? Despite politics, we're going to achieve it. Long live freedom, damn it.